Alright guys, got quite the Formula 1 news. The debriefs from the Barcelona test are well underway. Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari set the fastest lap time of the weekend, but how important really is that, especially given all the factors in play? And one key one which has not been massively discussed in recent days, it's been confirmed that at least some of the teams, if not potentially all, were using last year's fuels over the last couple of days. The reliability, the durability we saw of many of these power units may change drastically when the brand new sustainable 2026 fuels are in play. How will that change performance, reliability, all these other factors? What does it mean for these men on the screen? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Really appreciate all the new subs over the last few days as well. We're not far off 90,000 now. That's going to be a cool milestone. When we get there, we can see Fernando Alonso and Lawrence Stroll enjoying the unveiling of the AMR 26. We'll talk about that more in a second. Shakedown week is over. We're now on Saturday, January the 31st. We have Williams to reveal their car shortly, then Cadillac, then Aston Martin will probably show their livery, then it's McLaren, and in a couple of weeks we go to Bahrain for the first official test of the season. Now, the second test will have full coverage, as we understand. The first test will only have the last hour of the day getting broadcast, or something strange like that. But a fair bit is going to change between now and then, and of course we'll get to figure out how different the cars might be. Now, yesterday we talked about Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, putting in some good lap times. At the end of the day, Hamilton, it seemingly, there's a medium looks like there, but he bolted the soft tyres on and put in the fastest lap of the weekend in a Ferrari which is, as far as we understand, somewhat underdeveloped at this point in the season compared to where other cars maybe are. So this looks like a pretty impressive time on paper. Now, of course, George Russell's 1:16.4 was set the previous day. An extra day of trap conditions ramping up and all the driving that the teams were doing on the final day. Look, sure, Mercedes is still the most impressive team of the weekend, but this was pretty competitive, at least to show that they were confident in turning the engine up and giving it a few simulation qualifying runs, and that's what Hamilton was able to deliver. So Hamilton, Lando, of course, this was the final day. It was, of course, George Russell who put in a 1:16.4, and Antonelli wasn't too far behind. Lando did a 1:16.5. These were the number of laps completed on the final day as well. Max Verstappen did 118. Pierre Gasly put in 160. So good day from Alpine in terms of running after a difficult start to the weekend or the week. Ocon and Behrman, they combined for 190 odd laps. So yeah, they had quite the outing for Haas yesterday. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But the Ferrari power unit, 991 laps completed. There was a lot of talk going into this test. The reason why they were keeping it private, all the secrecy around it, the police and all this, was because they didn't want any negative PR coming out of the shakedown. If the teams were unreliable, if things were breaking down, it was going to be a bad look. And F1 wanted to avoid that as well. For some reason, when they did their, it was a bit of a compromise. They did do daily highlights, but when Hadjar crashed into the wall and broke the rear suspension, then they called it a small off, right? So there was clearly this spin doctoring that was happening out there, but it didn't seem massively necessary. The teams ran very well. Even Audi, who did encounter various issues, but the other teams, Alpine, who struggled early on, Cadillac, as time went on, they still got a fair bit of running in as well. Even Haas, they had some issues early in the test. They got plenty of running in. The Ferrari power unit did nearly 1,000 laps. So, it seemed to be fine. But again, as I say, there is a big caveat to all this that we'll get to in the coming minutes that potentially changes the game, especially when the season gets underway. But, 437 laps for the works Ferrari. These are the overall engine numbers. So Mercedes did 1,134 laps on their power unit over their four teams, of course. Ferrari at just under 1,000. Red Bull powertrains over only two teams was 624. That's pretty good going. Audi did 240 and Honda with Aston only 66 in the end. They only came for the last couple of days. The first day, they only did a few laps with Lance Stroll, but then the second day, they got some much better running in with the Aston Martin AMR 26. And of course, there's diminishing returns of lap time. Okay, Mercedes did, 8-9 times more laps as a team than Honda and Aston Martin did with the Honda power unit, but did they learn 8 times as much? No, maybe they learned twice as much or 3 times as much or something. But Williams earned, or they learned, 0 times as much. And that's why, presumably, Aston Martin decided to come, because even though it was a huge investment on their side to make this happen, and they didn't really get that many laps in compared to their rivals, they still learned a lot more than if they'd have stayed at home, and that could be critical. There was talk that they were going to do a filming shakedown day thing today, but apparently that's not happening anymore, so we'll talk about that in a second. These, by the teams, were the numbers. So Mercedes, 502 laps overall. Ferrari were second best at 429. Then it was Haas at 387 after a 191. I think that was the highest of any team did on a single day. So they nearly did 200 laps in a single day, which is crazy. 160 for Alpine, McLaren got 166, and they kind of needed a big final day because it wasn't smooth sailing for them after they debuted on the Wednesday. And yeah, McLaren, they had this fuel system issue, but they were able to resolve that and get some solid running in on the final day, just ahead of Audi, and then Cadillac further behind, who had a tricky test, and then of course Aston Martin, who, well, I think we saw the number at 66, this has it at 54. There's some, as I say, these are unofficial lap counts, but roughly they're in the right ballpark as far as we understand. Now, what's the takeaway in terms of who's the benchmark? The benchmark is still considered to be Mercedes. Thomas Maher says Mercedes is the team everyone keeps their eye on. One senior source said that the team is super focused and sharp. The entire body language of the team has lifted. So that seems a little concerning. BBC Sport, this was an Andrew Benson article, and he said, unsurprisingly, the top teams are in good shape as far as it is possible to tell, behind Mercedes. So Mercedes the benchmark, then Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull. They, again, is this just name value? That's what I always wonder. But there is something to be said for this. Apparently, within the noise of data, Ferrari, McLaren and Red Bull all in the same kind of ballpark. These cars are going to be very different to what's going to turn up to Melbourne. They're probably very different to what's going to turn up to Bahrain in a couple of weeks, frankly. So it's very early to take key takeaways, but Mercedes are clearly ahead, at least in some capacity. Who knows about performance? Alpine, Racing Bulls, Haas appear to have been the midfield. There's a feeling that Alpine have taken a significant step with their Mercedes engine. Then probably Audi, and then Cadillac at the back. Williams, who knows, right? They've not turned up yet. Now, Aston Martin, not any talk about them here, and for understandable reasons, because they are the big wild card. I thought there was some interesting comment on that car. We talked about it in detail yesterday, some of the features of it, but Craig Scarborough on Peter Windsor's channel said, it looks like they have unveiled the 2027 car, right? That's how extreme the design decisions are and the extent to which they've taken them to their conclusion. That's what I find fascinating about this Aston Martin Newey car, right? Is that it looks like they've had a whole year of running, and then as a result of all that testing and that development time, they then decided to go down this route. But instead, they've gone down this route immediately. It's far more aggressive and extreme than many of the other cars that we have seen in some of the conceptual ideas. Is it fast? Is it going to work? Who knows? There is questions as to why they pushed so hard to get to the circuit. Is Newey confident in the new wind tunnel? Is Newey confident the simulator tools work? Did he just need to see it on the track to verify, right? Rather than say, they didn't have to come to Barcelona. They could have done the Williams, but they decided not to, and that was crucial. Now, that car is fascinating. It's overweight, we believe quite significantly so, and it probably means that the Aston Martin that we currently see on track is the furthest away from its ultimate potential of any team. We can't really talk too much about lap times and all this. They only did a few laps. They didn't get into the type of running that some of the other teams did. But nonetheless, it appears that they are the team with potentially the most to gain and improve as the season goes on, with such an extreme approach that they have taken. If they don't win this championship, look, maybe the car doesn't work with all the risks they've taken. Maybe it's the engine, but if they don't, and obviously the Honda side of things is probably the key question really with Aston Martin this upcoming season, but they certainly would have tried to get to the top of Formula 1 if they don't get there. But apparently they're not going to hold that filming day. They could have done another 200 kilometers today, call it a filming day, but then they would have, had to unveil the livery, right? Because you can't really do a filming day with a black car, so they'd have to put the livery on, but that's getting revealed shortly, so do they want to do that? So it's interesting that they've decided not to do that. They might decide to wait a little longer to reduce the weight of the car intentionally. Maybe they feel that they'll get better data that way, save their filming day for later. Or maybe they're just pretty satisfied that they learned enough from yesterday's running that, okay, we know where we are, let's see how we go in a couple of weeks and save the filming day running until they have a car which is somewhat better positioned for the upcoming season. Maybe they're taking a bit of the weight out and stuff like that. So yes, the Mercedes feels like the benchmark. The Aston Martin is certainly the wild card of the season. That's how it appears right now. Some reaction from the drivers to the last few days. Again, take some of this with a little bit of a pinch of salt because they tend to do good PR running at this time of the season, right? That's usually how the teams and the, Formula One themselves want things to be positioned. And that's how it appears. So Max says, Red Bull powertrains have had a good start, but there are plenty of things we want to improve, but that's normal in this phase. Vasseur says, overall, positive session. Positive takeaways, wet at the beginning, dry at the ends, 160 laps on the board every day, not far off where Mercedes ended up. Charles says, now we've driven the real car, we've got to get back to the simulator and try and match up the data. I will say, Charles Leclerc looked like a happy man, and I don't know if there's too much to say about that, but it doesn't appear that Charles is super downbeat about their chances. It was clearly a positive test for Ferrari. They did more laps, maybe not than they expected precisely, but as much as they hoped, I would imagine, if not more. Hamilton says, look, there's always small things. There's been some downtime. Much better session and test than last year, Hamilton said, which he's very happy about. The generation is more fun to drive. We have less downforce than previous years. He actually went on to comment on that and said, the car generation is more fun to drive. It's oversteery and it's snappy and it's sliding. They obviously have less downforce, huge amounts of torque, but the cars are easier to catch. They feel a bit more nimble. They do feel like they've got a strong front end. I'm sure Charles Leclerc is going to be a big fan of that. I would definitely say more enjoyable, he says. And this, maybe as a result, is what Charles Leclerc was looking like. I mean, look at the smile on that face. And there were plenty of images similar to this of Charles over the last couple of days. So it seems like he's happy with the way that things are. The drivers seem happier with the cars. They're very interesting in the way that you have to drive them, but I think they're more fun to drive. The drivers are pretty clear on that. They may favour some driving styles over others. And yeah, Hamilton says we've had great debriefs with the team. The cars are more enjoyable, but we've still got lots of work to do to improve, as of course does everybody else. But this is the key asterisk. Of all of the things that we've mentioned over the last few days, there's a question on how much of what we have seen is relevant anyway, because it's testing. But there's the added complication this year of the fuels. And we talked a fair bit about this in the lead up to the test. There was a rumour that then seemingly became official that the teams were able to run on old fuels if they liked. The more conventional 2025 and previous fuels, the E10 or whatever they were, where there was a percentage of sustainable energy, but mostly it was from fossil fuels as before. However, this year the fuels are going fully sustainable. There is undoubtedly going to be some degree of performance differentiation between the Aramco fuel for Honda, the Shell fuel for the Ferrari engines, the Petronas fuel for Mercedes. I think it might be Exxon, is it, with, I think it's Exxon with Red Bull, stuff like that anyway. So you've got the fuel suppliers. They are creating their fuels in different ways. Some are going the e-fuel route, which is purely synthetic. Others, for example, Shell, they're going down the biofuel route using what they call feedstocks. So there's all sorts of options. But those fuels were apparently not in the car. Or certainly some maybe were, some weren't. We don't really know. But De Kester actually commented on this, and because Mattia replies and says, all things considered, apart from the real tests in Bahrain, what is the general opinion that you have? But De Kester says, we have just no real idea of performance at this point, and even, I would argue, reliability, right? Because, yeah, the engines looked real good over the last few days. Mercedes engines, 1,100 laps. Ferrari engines, basically 1,000 laps. Looking good, sure, wow, great reliability. Maybe that's true on the more conventional fuels, but on the fuel, I mean, the talk about the Shell Ferrari fuels was that the good batches are very powerful. The weaker batches are, because they're not so consistent, because of the way that they're creating the fuels, not every batch is the same. And that's causing problems in their testing. Now, there may be some solutions to that, but that's a concern. And it's not a concern that they potentially had to deal with the last few days because they may have just run their car on the old fuels to say, okay, well, the engine works with this, what we know. The car works, the active aero works, we're getting some good laps in, we're getting some good performance runs in as well. Fantastic. But when the teams put the real fuels in the car, that may certainly change the game. Because the feeling was that the fuels were not really ready in time. There's so much development of the fuels, like it's not really something that's massively discussed, but it's a big talking point this season that these sustainable fuels, this is really cutting edge technology. And as a result, every extra week and month, etc., that the teams work on this stuff and the fuel suppliers work on this, the better the fuels will potentially eventually be. So the FIA gave the teams the exemption to run them. Again, some teams may have run them, but we don't really know. And I would assume that lots of teams didn't. And then with the feeling that, okay, we'll get the mileage in here, we'll get the testing done. Then in Bahrain, presumably, then they will want to use the actual fuels, because then when the season starts, that's what they're going to have to use. So this is the big asterisk, and I think that's the key question of the day, is like how much of what we have seen, because we've got some takeaways from the last few days. There's no doubt about that. Mercedes look like the benchmark, Aston Martin, super unknown. The other teams are in the ballpark. Reliability looks good. Cadillac are off the back probably. Audi, they're struggling early doors, unsurprisingly. You know, it's some of the storylines that we might have expected. McLaren feel like a step off Mercedes, given that they're the world champions. You know, these are the talking points. But what, is 70, 80% of that invalid because they're not using the new fuels? Possibly, until we know any better and we have further updates on this coming forwards. De Kester also talks a little about Williams, saying that the car is in its final phase of assembly. Not clear how overweight the car is, but it's pretty clear that this is not ideal. It's not like Williams intended to do this to gain some sort of extra advantage. Look, maybe they turn up to Barcelona or to Bahrain with a rocket ship, having not come to Barcelona. But I think that's pretty unlikely. And yeah, if Aston Martin didn't learn anywhere near as much as, let's say, Mercedes did, then Williams didn't really learn anything at all. This is a cool shot actually here of the Red Bull, the Ferrari, and then the Haas coming around. What is this, like turn 3 at Barcelona? This is what the Red Bull looks like at what may be the same corner there, but wherever this is. This is the Red Bull in the sun. I think there have been some questions on the Red Bull livery because it looked really good, I thought, when they unveiled it. But it doesn't look quite the same on the track. When it's in the sun and you get the glare and the reflection of the gloss, then there is a few more, I think it looks a little bit more spectacular. Just before we close out the video, let's just quickly look at how the markets have reacted to this week of testing. These are the percentage differences from 1 week ago. So George Russell is now considered the quite substantial title favourite. It's obviously not clear-cut, but it wasn't long ago that Max was still considered title favourite just because he's Max, and everyone else, it wasn't really, Russell, Norris, etc., it wasn't really clear where they should be. But Russell's chances are now nearly like a third, it seems. Again, these are all dependent on who's thinking what, let's say, in the market. So it's all pinch of salt type stuff. But there's a fair bit of volume in these markets, so you get to see what people tend to think. Lando down to about 11%. Fernando Alonso is considered fourth favourite now for the title on his own, ahead of Antonelli, ahead of Piastri, and then the two Ferrari drivers. So, yeah, I think that's the question, right, with Aston Martin. If it works, it may work spectacularly, but the feeling is that Mercedes are on top, they are the benchmark, and as a result, George Russell should be the favourite. In fact, if you look at the constructors side of things, Mercedes are now considered 42%, up only slightly after the week, but still up. They've taken a lot of that ground, it seems, away from McLaren, who not long ago were right neck and neck really with Mercedes in this conversation. Now they've fallen further behind. Ferrari have gone up in estimation to an extent. Not massively so, but it has appeared to be a strong week for Ferrari. Again, these sustainable fuel conversations, let's say, muddy the waters to an extent. But yeah, those are seemingly the top four. Aston Martin with a similar chance to win the title as Alonso does. Then Williams somehow still in the conversation. I mean, they're not really in the conversation, but 1 in 50 feels ambitious, I think, there. Intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments below. Just one final stat. In Barcelona 2022, Mercedes tops the timings. Now, of course, they brought a very different car to the upcoming test in Bahrain when they unveiled the Zero Pod. that didn't really work. But Hamilton was top of that test. Of course, the times then were slower because the circuit was different. They didn't have the fast final corner like we do now. Russell was second. This year, the same story, 4 years on. Hamilton with the fastest time, a tenth ahead of Russell with the second fastest time. Of course, that season didn't go very well for Mercedes, so we'll see now they're on separate teams who is the winner and who is the loser. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.